Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar this evening. I'm Pam Wilson. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, the board. And I really want to thank you for taking some time out of your schedules to join us this evening. This is our second discussion of Ohio public education. If you were unable to join or watch our first conversation with Jack Schneider, I would really encourage you to go find it on the LWVO YouTube channel. Look for The Wolf at the Door. This is a discussion about the movement of public funding into private schools. Tonight, we want to focus in on vouchers, just one of the ways public funding is being funneled into private education. And just what is a voucher? Vouchers are state-funded scholarships, i.e. public dollars, that allow students to attend a private school instead of a public one. The state provides a set amount of money for private school tuition, either to the parent or directly to the private school. Vouchers are just one way public funding is being funneled into private schools. Other avenues Ohio legislators have put forward include ed savings accounts, which are state funding of an account that the parents will control, tax credits for homeschooling, and charter schools. In the last budgeting cycle, Ohio's legislature removed almost all conditional limits on accessing private school vouchers. This creates, in essence, two separate educational systems. One which is public, which is open to all and accountable to the community, and one which is private, which selects their own qualifying students and are only accountable to a private board and stakeholders. While both receive public funding, only public schools are transparent in how these funds are spent. Private, primarily religious schools preceded public education, but our founding fathers realized that education is crucial to a functioning democracy. Therefore, in state constitutions, provisions were made for the funding of public schools to prepare our students for our participation in our democracy. This is good for all of us. But we've seen the pressure for privatization over the course of our history. School choice has historical origins in the mid to late 20th century, in the writings of libertarian economist Milton Friedman in the 50s, in the freedom of choice and other schemes that white supremacists developed to thwart racial integration in the 60s. And again, in the 60s, charter and private schools were a reaction to underperforming segregated schools. Magnet schools, for example, were originally developed as a means to improve diversity and academic rigor. During the 90s, a third wave included swapping the creation of uniform standards and measurements of student performance for greater freedom from regulation, and this led to an explosion of charter schools. The first statewide school choice policy in Ohio, EdChoice, was enacted in 2005 for students who were enrolled in or assigned to an underperforming public school, regardless of family income. But academic studies on the impact of privatization shows that it actually exacerbates segregation. School choice leads to lower quality public schools due to the loss of students and financial resources. The students who are left behind suffer. In Ohio, the latest change in eligibility for EdChoice Expansion vouchers and its $1 billion price tag has turned vouchers into an entitlement that primarily benefits the wealthy. The League, both at the national and state level, has a long-standing history of supporting and fighting for public education. Our League member, Susie Kaiser, and former State Representative Steve Dyer will review the current state of vouchers in Ohio, the characteristics of private schools that can receive public funds, future forms of privatization, and the implications of privatizing education. Our moderator tonight, Susie Kaiser, has served as the LWVO education specialist on school funding for the last 5 years. She's a public education advocate and for 17 years directed a nonprofit organization to support the Cleveland Heights, University Heights schools. Her interest in vouchers is grounded in the devastating effect EdChoice vouchers have had on her community. Last year, she analyzed and reported on the absence of private schools in most Ohio counties and the essential role of public schools. Her weekly visits over the last 35 years to work with students in her neighborhood elementary schools keep her passionate about public education. I'm also happy to introduce our funding expert, Steve Dyer, who started his long-term advocacy to improve school funding as a member of the Ohio House. Between 2007 and 2010, he served as the chair of the Elementary and Secondary Education Subcommittee of House Finance and designed the bold and nationally recognized evidence-based approach to making school funding in Ohio constitutional. As a policy fellow at Innovation Ohio, he delved into the issues surrounding charter schools and vouchers. He is an attorney and an award-winning journalist. He frequently comments on privatization in his blog, 10th Period, a great resource for understanding state policy. He currently serves on the advisory. Susie, Steve, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you all for being here, and to Pam for setting the historic context for looking at vouchers in Ohio. I'm going to do a little bit more than moderate. I'm going to do some presenting too. So the voucher explosion is about big ideas and many, many details. We hope to help you understand that the big puzzle. It affects why the recent increase in access to vouchers is significant and concerning. Advocates for privatizing education have couched this aspiration in the language of choice. How can anyone disagree that parents should make good choices for their children, including where to attend school? Aaron Churchill of the Thomas Fordham Institute recently argued, these dollars are for the kids, regardless of whether it is a public school or a private school. In this view, the only benefit derived from funding education that matters is the benefit to the individual who is educated. But public schools and private schools are not the same. Their purposes and benefits are different. Ohio has always had private schools, which operate independently and with minimal state oversight or regulation. And Ohio families have always had the right to direct the education of their children, to make education choices, including to attend a private school. What makes this call for choice different is the demand for taxpayers to pay for that choice. Privatizing changes education from serving the common good to upholding individual rights. Funding private schools, as if they are public, ignores the profound differences between serving the public and serving a private interest. Benjamin Barber sums up the impact of privatizing education when he said, vouchers transform what ought to be a public question, what is a good public education system for our children, into a personal question, what kind of education do I want for my children? For nearly 200 years, families who opted out of the public system that they helped fund accepted responsibility for funding the alternative that they preferred. So this began to change in 1997 when Ohio authorized its first voucher program. As we explore the recent decision by the Ohio legislature to make vouchers an entitlement, it's important to have some basic understanding of K-12 education in Ohio, including private education. So children in Ohio are required to attend school. We have a compulsory education law. There are 5 ways in which you can satisfy that obligation. First, of course, is our public system. That's the one that most students and families choose. It's a statewide system that guarantees access to everyone and is governed by local elected boards of education and state rules and regulations. Most kids attend them. Public schools often encourage choice within their districts, and there's also the option of attending a public school in a nearby district through open enrollment. Also, Ohio also allows for homeschooling. The state essentially waives the compulsory attendance laws for homeschooling. We also have charter and STEM schools. They're also known as community schools. And the language here can be very confusing. So a charter school, these were invented in 1997 in Ohio, and we have about 330 of them in the state. These schools are privately owned and operated, but are also publicly funded. Like a public school, they cannot charge tuition and must have open admission. Their books can be audited by the state. Many are online and some are for profit. They were initiated, as Pam pointed out, to show the benefits of deregulation and whether that would lead to improved quality in schools. And it really didn't turn out to be a very good positive outcome. Even though the Department of Education and Workforce counts them as public schools, they are part of the privatizing movement. So these are not the schools that receive vouchers. We have two categories now of private schools. They are the administrative responsibility for our private education resides within the Office of Non-Public Education Options within the Department of Education and Workforce. Private schools are not a system. They are a collection of independently operated and governed schools. They select students from those who apply, and they charge tuition. Private schools are anything but uniform. The two categories that we have are also quite different. The first one I want to talk about is the non-chartered, non-public schools. The connection with state government is very limited. Basically, they register with the state, agree to provide 182 days of instruction, and to have staff who have some education credentials. A Bible college degree is an acceptable degree to teach in one of these schools. They don't tell the state who attends them, so there isn't really data collected on how many students, although there was an estimate here of 32,000 that came from a recent analysis by the Legislative Service Commission. The second category are the chartered non-public schools. These are the schools that are eligible for vouchers. In 2023, there were 715 of them registered with the Department of Education and Workforce. Most have been around for a long time, long before there were vouchers. It will be interesting to see how many new schools seek a charter now that public funding is so generous. Chartered non-public schools, the private schools that receive vouchers, are different from school to school in many ways. For example, the Private School Review reported on the tuition costs, which range between $1,100 at a high school down the street from me to the highest, which is $60,000. The median tuition cost is about $5,500. Enrollment size, the median is about 180 students, but at least 60 schools have fewer than 25 kids, and 200 have less than 100. The largest 4 schools in the state have between 1,000 and 1,500 students. They also differ in staff credentials, student-teacher ratios, curriculum, rigor, outcomes, mission, and purpose. We also know they're not equally available across the state. There are 11 counties with no private schools and 49 more with between 1 and 3. So only 20 counties have more than 20 private schools. That's where choice exists in Ohio. Some provide all of the education opportunities and support that make for excellence. Some of the best schools in our state are arguably excellent, and many don't. They lack common expectations or accountability standards or requirements for public disclosure. There's nothing systematic about it. Next slide, please. The chartering process is the primary regulatory tool for private education. Accountability is in the hands of the parents who use the school and the governing body that owns it. Private schools with 15 kids or 3 grade levels who agree to offer a general education of high quality and are willing to advertise that they do not discriminate on the basis of race or nationality can apply for a charter. In order to receive a charter from the Department of Education and Workforce, a school has to go through a process to become accredited. This is a list of the primary accrediting organizations for schools in our state. Most of them, as you can see, are religious, and more than half of our private schools, 369, are Catholic. There are 46 independent schools, and about 40 are accredited by the National Association of Independent Schools. The Ohio Administrative Code calls for the state superintendent to form an advisory committee made up of representatives of these private school organizations. They're the ones that are asked to provide, to advise on how private education is regulated in the state. I was not ever able to find a list of who those people are. Because of our long-held commitment to separation of church and state, they are allowed to operate, and they are subject to minimal state regulation. But once money began to flow to private schools, it didn't bring with it a lot of regulation that typically follows public funds. That includes sunshine laws, accountability for outcomes, and financial transparency. That means there are few safeguards for students, families, or taxpayers. And another thing to remember about public funds in private schools in this state is that using public funds didn't start with vouchers. Beginning in 1965, after more than 150 years of following the Constitution's limitation on funding public schools, the legislature allowed for private school students to be transported by their local public schools. Then they added funding for auxiliary services and administrative costs. So by the 1990s, we were one of the most generous states in the country for funding private education with public funds. The state continues to provide these funds to private schools and spends more per pupil in many private schools than it does in our public schools. So what we think of as privatizing education really began with vouchers in our state. Instead of funding school operations, vouchers support the individual's choice. A voucher is a publicly funded scholarship, as Pam explained, paid for with public funds. While this is defined as a choice for families, the school is deciding who has access to public funds. Another important detail is that private schools are not required to accept vouchers. It is their choice. Last year, there were 550 of chartered non-public schools that participated in the EdChoice program. A smaller number participated in the other 4 voucher programs. Another important detail is that once a student is awarded a voucher in Ohio, they are guaranteed the ability to renew that until they graduate from school. So this is a very long-term commitment. Okay, the next slide, Karen. So expansion has been a feature of voucher policy since the Cleveland Scholarship Program started in 1997. It's been like a drippy faucet with incremental changes in individual student eligibility and scholarship amounts. Finally, in 2023, the pipes broke and everyone became eligible. That's the explosion we are here to understand. The first program was in Cleveland. The focus was on low-performing schools and trying to give children an opportunity to escape them. The second round of expansion focused on children with disabilities. The autism and John Peterson programs were created because children needed some specialized services, and it seemed that vouchers were a way to give access to those services. Then came our 2 different EdChoice programs, and it's a little confusing because we have 2 EdChoice programs. So the first one focused again on test performance, like in Cleveland. It was trying to give, based on a low-performing school, children from that school community access to a private option. The second one, the EdChoice Expansion program, is the one that we're looking at tonight. And it was started in 2015 as a way to provide vouchers based on the income of the household. It started at 200% of poverty, then increased to 250% 2 years ago, and now jumped to 450%. The explosion we're talking about is the decision in 2023 to lift the limit on income eligibility for the EdChoice Expansion scholarships. Families with incomes up to 450% of poverty are entitled to the full value of a voucher, and partial funding is available to everyone else, regardless of their income. Today, vouchers are available wherever there are private schools and to everyone who is admitted to a private school and asks for a state scholarship. Karen, next. I want to extend my gratitude to Tanisha Pruitt for Policy Matters, who, as she was analyzing what 450% means, she put it in the context of the other priorities in the income eligibility level of households to access those. And it's really clear that our lawmakers put private education as their priority for Ohio's children, not child nutrition, childcare, or healthcare. Next. So when the lawmakers increased eligibility, the number of vouchers issued exploded. You'll notice in each of the 3 years that I've reported the data for, the numbers have increased. But the change between last year and this year, the total was a 60,000 increase. And if you look at EdChoice Expansion on the top level, you'll see that this is where the explosion took place. By changing the eligibility for this particular voucher, the number awarded last year was 24,000, and the number awarded this year was 84,000. So almost all of the increase in vouchers that were awarded this year were because of EdChoice Expansion. So at this time, I want to call on Steve Dyer to help us understand why 450% of poverty is a watershed moment. Who is benefiting? What is the cost to taxpayers? What is the impact on who goes to school together? What does this mean for our public system and full funding of public education?
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, hello, everybody. I know I've probably presented to many of you before over the years, and it's good to be back, although it's bad to be involved in having to explain this monstrosity that has become Ohio's voucher program. Next slide, please, Karen. This is the amount of money going to fund and subsidize private school tuition since the program started in 1997. And that's not $3 and $600. That's $3 million and $600 million that it's gone up by. And as you can see, there's been a slow, steady explosion. This coming school year, it will be even higher and will probably be around the $1 billion mark, just based on estimates of the increase in voucher students this year. And what does that mean? Well, the money that pays for vouchers comes out of the same state budget line that funds the 1.5 million kids in Ohio's public schools. So if you're taking out $600 million and giving it to subsidize tuition at private schools, you don't have that $600 million to provide to the 1.5 million kids who are in public schools. Therefore, you don't fully fund the Fair School Funding Plan, for example, which is the current way we fund schools in Ohio. And in fact, we are not fully funding public schools in Ohio. The state is admitting that, and they're going through a 6-year phase-in plan. We'll see if it gets fully phased in. But a large reason why it's not able to be funded more quickly is because they keep shoveling bags and bags of cash over to private schools. And one thing that, hasn't really been talked about a lot is because these are going to private schools, the state has never audited a single dollar that has ever gone to a voucher. So we have no idea how this money is being spent. We don't know if it's being spent on instruction. We don't know if it's being spent on killer rides for private school administrators. We have no idea. So we could be having, 3 or 4 ECOTs happening right underneath our noses, but we have no idea because we simply have not audited a single penny of the approximately $13 billion we've sent to private schools by subsidizing their tuition. Next. And as you can see, this hasn't led to an explosion in private school enrollment. One of the things that we have always been told is that, we need to rescue kids from public schools so that they can go to private schools. That's just not what's happening. What's happening is basically we are subsidizing the kids who are already in private schools. We just, the vast majority of money now going to fund vouchers are going to actually subsidize the schools. Back when the vouchers started, in fact, there's a paper trail on this. This is something that former House Speaker Bill Batchelder worked out with a longtime public education nemesis David Brennan back in the late 90s. Is one of the reasons that they started the program was because enrollment was falling quickly in private schools. And so one of the questions that was asked of that Batchelder asked was, how many open seats are there? He asked that of all the dioceses in the state, and they said about 5,000. And guess what? 5,000 seats created. So it was meant to increase enrollment in private schools. Here's a dirty little secret. You saw that there are approximately 150,000 students taking vouchers now. There aren't 150,000 open seats in private schools. So nearly all the money now is going to subsidize tuition for students whose parents can already afford to send them to private schools. We're just giving them some public money to ease the pain of paying the tuition. Next. And here's another thing that you don't hear this much anymore from the privates, from the voucher folks anymore. Now it's all about school choice and all that. It used to be we need better options for students who come from struggling districts, and I'm putting that all in air quotes, but I won't air quote you to death here. But what you see here is that the longer students take vouchers, the worse they do on state tests. Now, I am a proponent of not boiling everything down to a single test, but what you can see is it's a very troubling trend where you see the longer you get the voucher, the worse you do on state testing. And if this were happening in public schools, can you imagine the outrage at the legislative level that would be forcing these schools to be more accountable for their kids' performance and all this kind of nothing like that has ever been talked about on the private school side. In fact, what we found is that in the Cincinnati Enquirer looked at 2 years of data a couple years ago and found that in almost 9 of 10 cases, students that were attending the private school in the city from which the vouchers were coming actually performed worse than the kids that were in the public school at the time. So again, this whole myth about creating a better option for kids and all that, all the data indicates that this is not doing that. And in fact, it's doing worse. In fact, students do worse if they take a voucher. Next. Here's another real problem with vouchers. This has been true since 2002, at least, when Policy Matters first looked at this issue. Generally, what you see is a far greater percentage of white students get vouchers than the communities from whence they came. And so what you have is, for example, 9 in 10 voucher students come from about 31 school districts that are in the EdChoice, the traditional EdChoice program. And they are only about 22% white communities. Yet over 46% of the traditional EdChoice voucher recipients are white. That's a problem. If you're trying to, argue that we need this opportunity for more minority students, and yet the opportunity is being granted to is pulling more white students out of minority districts, guess what? You've got state-sanctioned racial segregation. That's a real problem because, as often as Supreme Court justices seem to disagree on different rulings that have been made over the years, the one thing they all seem to agree on is that Brown versus Board of Education is settled law. Next slide, please. And you'll see that's even true in EdChoice expansion districts. There are about 9 in 10 voucher students coming from about 252 public schools. And yes, they are much wider student population than the traditional EdChoice voucher schools. But even in those school districts, somehow vouchers find white students at a greater rate than the students that are in the community. So even among the whiter districts, the private school vouchers are getting even wider populations of students. It's a very troubling problem, and it's the thing that, frankly, is driving a lot of the EdChoice voucher lawsuit that's going on right now. That's based on a lot of this data. Next. So, for example, here's just kind of, I broke it down to Lima, and the reason I picked Lima is because the foremost voucher proponent in the state legislature is Senate President Matt Huffman, who wants to be House Speaker Matt Huffman next year. He's from Lima, and what you can see is that Lima is 36% Black, 9% Hispanic, and about 35% white, and the rest is multiracial. Temple Christian, St. Charles are private schools that take voucher students. They take a significant number of voucher students, each over 200 when you combine the two EdChoice programs. No Black or Hispanic students go to those schools, and nearly all the students that take the voucher are white. The ones who are not are multiracial. So it's just, how is that happening? Is it just magic, or is it because they can select and there's something else going on? And the fact that the legislature doesn't really care about this, or has tried to cover it up, or hasn't addressed it, even though they've known about it since 2002, this is the same phenomenon that's happening in Cleveland. A greater percentage of white students take it than are going to Cleveland itself. The fact that they've known this since 2002 and they haven't done anything about it is a major problem for the constitutionality of this program. Next. And here you go, the new vouchers. There have been 59,970 new vouchers distributed this year through the EdChoice Expansion program. Almost 90% of them are going to white students. Riddle me that, Batman. Next. Okay, and here's another problem: the per pupil funding. The state provides about $5,545 per student average. We're looking. I mean, it's not the formula anymore, but that's about the average amount that the state spends on public schools. And remember that the only thing that the state is required to do in the Constitution is to fund a thorough and efficient system of public schools. That's the only thing that the legislature is required to do in the Constitution. So you've got $5,545 going to public schools. You've got over almost $10,500 in state aid per pupil going to charter schools, which are publicly funded, privately run. You've got $8,400 a student going to private schools to subsidize high school tuition. You've got $6,100 a student going to subsidize primary and secondary to the K-8 private school tuition, and then special ed voucher and obviously the autism voucher are much higher. So what you're seeing here is every time a high school EdChoice voucher is taken, that's already almost $3,000 more per student than the typical public school. And go to the next slide. And what you can see is that there are 611 school districts in the state, and 359 of them get less per pupil state funding than the primary, than the K-8 EdChoice voucher. 481 of them get less than the high school EdChoice voucher. And of course, nearly all of them get less than the special ed, autism, or charter money. So again, what you see is every time money goes out to a voucher, that is significantly more money that has to be raised locally to make up for that lost revenue. Next. And here's the I think this kind of just breaks down what's going on here. The blue line is the amount of money going to education in the state budget. The red line is how much of it goes to public school students. And what you can see is there's a huge difference between the amount of money that is going to education overall and the amount that's going to fund the education of 1.5 million kids in public schools. And you can see that what the pro voucher folks always talk about is the blue line. The blue line's gone up over the years. It's way higher than it used to be. They never talk about the red line. And why don't they talk about the red line? Because, next slide. You can see the amount of money that kids in school districts were getting in 1997, if you just adjust for inflation, is almost $800 less per pupil than they're getting now. And that's solely because of the commitment that the state has made to fund private school education. So if they weren't shuffling all that money off to privately run schools, you might be able to say that we're a little bit above where we were in 1997. The other thing about 1997 is that's not like some magic number. 1997 was the first year of the first case that said that the way we fund schools is unconstitutional because the state doesn't provide enough money. It was the first of 4 Supreme Court rulings that found that. So that's an inadequate, that 97 inflation adjusted number is even inadequate. And we can't get up to that. So, I mean, that's the reality. And that's why they always talk about full funding for students. And they talk about, whenever they talk about how much money is going to public schools, they always include the locally raised revenue to talk about the per pupil funding. They always talk about the total amount being spent on education. They never back out the private school subsidies that are being given. And that the reason they do that is because they know they're in a world of hurt if they do it. Next. So this slide, I wanted to kind of show you that every school district loses money to EdChoice, either through the expansion or the traditional EdChoice program. And as you can see, suburban districts almost lose as much money now as the big 8 urban districts like Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, Dayton, Akron, Toledo, Youngstown. You add up those voucher numbers, and they're comparable to suburban districts now. Now, these aren't the wealthy suburban districts like Orange or something, but these are the more working class suburban districts like North Royalton and those places. And so what you have is this explosion is taking money away from districts in all kinds of communities throughout the state. You've got small town districts losing money. You've got rural poor districts losing money. You've got suburban districts. You've got non-major urbans, places like Ashland and Mansfield. You've got large urbans losing money. Every kind of district is losing money. This is not an urban issue. This is not it's not just, for districts like those to worry about anymore. This is about all of our districts are losing money and losing significant amounts of money to subsidize kids whose parents can already afford to send them to private school because they already are. Next. Here's another outrageous thing. Because they lifted the cap on the amount of money that can be given, what you see here is that the number of recipients getting vouchers now for families making over 750% of the poverty level, which for a family of 4 is roughly $240,000 a year, is the second highest category of any of the categories. So we're giving more money. We're giving more vouchers to families making over $150,000 a year than we are to families making under $125,000 a year. This has nothing to do with giving poor kids opportunities anymore or poor families opportunities anymore. This is all about subsidizing upper middle class to wealthy families' decision to already send their kids to private school. This isn't when they expanded this poverty level up, into the stratosphere. That had nothing to do about allowing struggling kids from Orange to escape so they can go to Western Reserve Academy. That is not what this was about. This was about kids who already are going to private school now getting a public subsidy to offset a significant chunk of their tuition bill. And I don't think a single person in the state of Ohio when they passed a school levy, every thought that that school levy would go to subsidize private school education, but that's what it's doing right now. Next. So about $2.3 million went to subsidize the private school tuitions of families who make more than $250,000 a year. And now 242 million of the 272 sent to families for the traditional EdChoice program are not considered low income. So as you can see, a significant portion of the amount of money going out to vouchers now are going to subsidize tuition for families who are already not only can afford to send their kids to private school, but always have. And that's kind of the outrage, because, you know, the whole idea as it was originally sold to us was we need to send a message to these struggling public schools. And one of the ways we can do that is we can use our state money to pay for tuition for students to go to higher performing private schools, and that'll show them. These kids were never in the public schools for them to even have, quote unquote, failed them. Yet we're subsidizing them to the tune of $2.3 million for families who are making $250,000 a year or more. I don't think a single legislator could look you in the face and say, yeah, you know, a family making $250,000 a year, you know what they need? They need a public subsidy to send their kid to a private school. I can't imagine a single person who's a single legislator who would look you straight in the eye and say, yeah, that's a good idea. But they're doing it. Next.
Yeah, so here's my question. So despite this huge expansion of EdChoice vouchers, we already have two new bills to spend even more public money in new ways on private education.
Susie, can I interrupt you for 1 minute? Because I'm going to ask Steve one question that has come up.
Sure.
Would you take a minute to talk about the lawsuit? Because, you know, as you're talking, that has come up in the Q&A.
Yeah. There's currently a lawsuit in Franklin County. The same group of the same organization that sued over the original school funding case in the 1990s has taken this up. They're suing based on the fact that the funding for the private education subsidies is taking money away from kids who aren't being fully funded in the public schools. And they're suing based on the racial issue that I've pointed out. And they're suing on several of the other issues. I mean, there are 5 of them that they named. I don't want to get into all of that because that would involve doing legal briefs. But I do. They're doing a very. They're being very thorough. They are. They've got serious lawyers on it, and we're going to see how it works out. But it's in court in Franklin County, and it'll probably go to trial sometime later this year. So keep an eye on that. There are approximately 120 odd school districts who have signed on. If you know of school districts that should be signed on and aren't, contact vouchers@ohio.org. And they are that's who's organizing a lot of this, vouchers@ohio.org.
Right. So I wanted to bring up the fact that there are two new pieces of legislation that just happened in the last couple of weeks. One would create education savings accounts, which would the big thing that's important here is that it would extend public money to the non-chartered, non-public schools, the totally unaccountable, just this, to a very weak part of our education opportunity structure in this state. And House Bill 2, which is the capital improvement budget, Senator Huffman and the Buckeye Institute have also suggested that it's time to open up those public funds that have gone for school improvements to private schools. What do you think? What's the end game? What else can happen? Where do we go from here? You're muted, Steve.
I'm muted. Sorry, my first Zoom. Right. The end game is something that was articulated by Christina Rogner, who's gone between the House and the Senate. But I'll never forget this. In 2010, when she first ran, she gave an ed board meeting she talked to the ed board at the Beacon Journal for an endorsement interview. And during that, she said, I think we should just give everyone $5,000 and have them go wherever they want. And I think that's the end game. The end game is to just, say, we're going to give you X number of dollars. You can go wherever you want. Let's build some private schools in rural areas so they have private schools too, and wash our hands of it. I think that's the end game, and ultimately, I think a lot of what's driving this. I mean, if you want to talk about the realpolitik of the thing, is what David Brennan would often say when he was doing this in the late 90s, when he would go to the Diamond Grill in downtown Akron. He would tell people, we got to kill the teachers unions, and this is one way to do it.
So the League of Women Voters has a really wonderful position on privatizing a public good. The statement is that it calls for ensuring transparency, accountability, positive community impact, and preservation of the common good when considering the transfer of government services, assets, or functions to the private sector. Vouchers have privatized education in Ohio, but they fail to meet any of these criteria for being an appropriate privatized approach. It's interesting to me that just this week, Representative Manning and Representative Seitz introduced House Bill 407, which is the first ever, as far as I know, maybe you can correct me, set of regulations for schools that accept vouchers. And while it's not entirely robust, some of the characteristics are it requires schools to administer the same state tests as public schools and to publish the outcome. It requires private schools to supply expenditure data for scholarship students, which would be, I think, something like auditing. And it requires schools to adopt admissions procedures. So this is a first step. And it's a significant development, I think. I don't know if it has any chance of going anywhere, but
no.
So what do you think what do you think I think it's courageous for legislators to to even offer this at this point.
Right.
But would you like to comment on that and your notion of what would be a top priority?
Yeah, I think that Gail Manning, who's from Lorain County, has always been a champion of public education. I've worked with her on many things, and she has, been willing to buck her party on a lot of public education issues. Bill Seitz is retiring, and is kind of a cantankerous dude, but he's really smart. He gets it. He's from Cincinnati, which is important because the Cincinnati Archdiocese has always been a very strong proponent of EdChoice and vouchers and administrative cost reimbursements and all kinds of other stuff. So the fact that you have these two folks who are together on this bill is pretty important. It does not call for straight audits, so he wouldn't be, so the auditor wouldn't be coming in and looking at the private school books. All you're doing is requiring them to actually report what they're spending the voucher money on, which I think is a good first step. But it certainly is nowhere near the kind of regulation that public schools have to do. But at least it gives you an idea of what's going on. Back in 2009, when we did the evidence-based model of school funding in the budget bill that year, one of the things that we got in there was testing kids who take vouchers. And that's one of the few things that still survives from House Bill 1. So we do have testing data from voucher students. The issue is that private schools can come up with alternative assessments. And so it's not a complete apples to apples comparison because not every kid takes the same test that the kid in the public school takes. But at least, that would bring some homogenation to that comparative analysis, which I think is important for families to know. It's not unlike what the Transformation Alliance does, where it puts up all the data for charter schools in Cleveland, along with the local public schools, and there are comparisons. And there could be a whole other thing about how effective that is, but I do think that that's a good step on the path toward transparency. But it's certainly nothing that it's certainly not what everything that's needed. But the fact they brought it up is important. I don't think it's going anywhere, but we'll see.
Yeah, I guess this is just to say that this is a dynamic issue and it's never ending. And I'm afraid it doesn't end until it's complete. So I'm worried about that. So at this point, I'd be, Karen, would you like to include some of the questions that we've got? We've got a few minutes for some questions. You're muted, Karen.
We will make sure you have time to wrap up.
Yeah.
There are a number of questions too in regard to, you talked about number one, that basically students coming out of the charter schools usually perform poorer than the public schools. So there was a question about, well, then why do parents send their children to these schools? And then also about testing. How do we know? How can we compare? And is there testing of students who are in these schools receiving these vouchers?
Yeah, there is testing. You have to have a critical mass of voucher students to test them, to be required to test them. But once you reach that critical mass, you have to test them. Private schools can get alternative assessments, so they're not always using the same test, but it's pretty close. And then why do parents send their kids to schools that don't test well? It's kind of how I explain what I call the Sharknado effect. Sharknado was a terrible movie, but lots of people liked it. But that doesn't make it a good movie. And it's the same thing here. There can be any one of a number of reasons why people decide to send their kids to the private school that they're sending them to. It can be everything from, that's where you went, to, that's where their friends are going, to that's where, you feel like they have a better program for robotics or, something. I mean, it can be, or it can just be, a lot of parents who send their kids to charter schools that aren't doing well, they're wined and dined essentially with, really nice, really nice neighborhood carnivals or, things like that. Things that don't have much to do with that have to do with education. I'm reminded of what Mackie Raymond said a few years ago, that what she found was that who's from the Hoover Institute, which is a pro privatization outfit out of Stanford, and she said quite candidly that parental choice has not been an effective way to improve school choice options, and it's because parents are choosing all kinds of reasons to send their kids to the schools, and unfortunately, academics isn't usually one of the top, 2 or 3 things they do. It has to do with something else. So again, that's the long and short answer of it. And frankly, my position on testing has always been that it's a snapshot of one day, and a couple hours in it out of a 182-day year. So it's very limited in what it can tell you.
There were a couple of questions about who benefits in the end, who's really making the money in terms of the subsidies going to private schools. And I know there are differences, and it makes a difference which type of school it is, but who are some of the people benefiting, and how has our state gotten in trouble in regard to that by not demanding accountability?
Well, on the private school side, we have no idea because we don't know how the money's being spent. So, the short answer is private schools are benefiting. They're benefiting because they don't have to go out and do massive fundraisers as much anymore. They're benefiting in that they can bump up their tuition and still keep the same number of kids, but still, make a little bit on the side. I don't know that is translating down to the teachers in private schools, who are infamously underpaid. But again, we don't know because we don't know how that money's being spent. What we can say is we do have extensive experience with charter schools, which are privately run, publicly funded. And we do know that, for instance, the electronic classroom of tomorrow made off with hundreds of millions of dollars to educate kids they never could prove they actually educated. So, we do have a deep experience, deep and rich and sordid history with this kind of thing in Ohio. And we know how it's ended up when we have been able to look at the books and check enrollments and all that kind of thing. But when we're dealing with vouchers, there's really not a whole lot of information, and that's part of the problem with not being a very transparent program. We simply don't know. There could be 2 or 3 different ECOTs in this going on right now, and we just have no idea. But what I can say is that since this explosion has happened, you have entities that have zero history running schools, like, say, the Citizens for Christian Virtue, which is a lobbying organization in Columbus, setting up private schools to take vouchers. And how much of that money is ending up in legislators' pockets through lobbying and fundraisers and that kind of thing? Who knows? But that organization was not interested in educating kids until suddenly, hey, $8,400. I'll take that.
In terms of all of this, is there any way of pushing back on the start of new schools in really good districts?
Yeah, I mean, not really. I wish I could give you a better answer, but if you know who, on the charter school side, you can kind of find out who the sponsor of the school is. The way charter schools work is they have to find somebody to quote unquote sponsor them, which can be everything from a school district to the state board of education to the to a education service center. But it also can be a nonprofit. So it could be, like the Fordham Institute does it. So if it's a nonprofit, there's not much you can do. If it's a public sector operation, then yeah, you might be able to go to a meeting of the, Lake Erie West Education Service Center and say, you should not sponsor this school in my community or something like that. But once they get a sponsorship and it goes to the Department of Ed, the Department of Ed has very little leeway in being able to grant these charters for charter schools. On the private school side, there's even less. So, I mean, if they're opening in your community, about all you can do is, good old fashioned grassroots activism, holding a sign in front of the entrance or, something like that. But it is certainly not up to the local school board. It is certainly not up to the local community. It is up to, whoever wants to bankroll them.
I'm going to use this next question as a transition for Susie to wrap up, since we only have about 3 more minutes. What can we do? How can we fix this?
Well, one of the major things you can do is support the effort to ungerrymander our legislative districts. That would be nice. It would be nice to be able, a lot of these, guys who are, let's face it, most of them are guys who are pushing for this are in districts that they don't have to worry about anybody beating them in a general election, just in the primary. So they tend to be very much over to one side of the ledger. And so if you have legislative districts that are more representative of their communities, then, they have to kind of listen to you more. But other than that, I mean, it's just getting involved in the lawsuit and, making hay online, making hay at the legislature, take a page out of the book of, the charter schools back in the early 2000s, where they would, bring busloads of kids down to Columbus during the budget cycle and say, you can't hurt our kids and that kind of thing, even though they weren't in school that day. And, do some of that, get involved in your local school district, support your local public schools, make sure you bring this up to the school board, ask why, if they haven't signed on to the lawsuit, ask them why, try to get them to sign on to the lawsuit. So again, I mean, there are those kinds of things, but ultimately this changes when the composition of the legislature changes. And that's probably only going to happen if we're able to get fair district lines. That's probably going to have to be before the voters in November.
I just want to add that actually in Illinois, they repealed their voucher program, or I think it was a tax credit program, but it is possible to actually reverse this. Possible in Ohio is another question.
Yeah,
altogether.
the makeup of the Illinois legislature is somewhat different
Yes,
than the
exactly.
makeup of the Ohio legislature.
I know, just to say, it does seem like it's stuck forever, but we can dream on. You've actually taken my thunder here on where do we go from here. We have to continue to advocate for full funding of our public system. And I think the more we can point out the travesty of privatizing, taking money and putting it in subsidizing people with wealth to use a private school as a ridiculous priority over our public system. I think we need to use that argument as much as we can. We need to be vigilant about these new proposals to expand it. They're going to keep coming, and we got to keep being at it. I think pushing on accountability is an extremely important option, although for me, it's an all or nothing thing here. They're not right. Public funds should not go to private education. But we need to keep working on who's elected to service in the legislature, join the league and the lobby corps. So I think another thing that we need to do is demystify this whole idea of choice. When I see the reporting on privatization and Aaron Churchill's quote about it's just about the kids never being challenged about it's not just about the kids really troubles me. I think we need to do a lot more of illuminating the values involved in privatizing and demystify both that private education is better than public and that choice is really not about anything but an income transfer. So that's where we are. I can't thank you enough, Steve, for sharing all that knowledge and outrage. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I hope you learned something. I hope this gave you a glimpse into the seriousness of where we are in our state and the threat to our public schools. Our public schools are worth the fight. I want to keep fighting. I hope we'll all keep fighting for them. Here's just some resources in case you want to look at, learn more. So thanks a lot, everybody. Yay. Good night.